On a quiet stretch of land in north-central Florida, archaeologists opened a pit that looked almost ordinary. There was no ruined temple, no stone monument, no gold, just a depression in the ground near an ancient mound. But as the soil was carefully removed, something began appearing in quantities that were anything but ordinary. Pottery, then more pottery, and more. Thousands of broken ceramic pieces were packed into the same small area. Eventually, the excavation would reveal more than 4,500 pottery sherds, an evidence of a massive gathering that had taken place here roughly 8 centuries ago. But the pottery wasn't even the strangest thing in the pit. Beneath it were thousands of animal remains, charcoal, stone tools, fire-cracked rocks, and the bones of dozens upon dozens of deer. The evidence suggested that this wasn't simply a place where people lived. It may have been the remains of something much more unusual, a feast, and perhaps a ritual. The deeper archaeologists looked, the clearer one thing became. This small pit was telling the story of an event that had brought together far more people, food, pottery, and activity than anyone would expect from such a seemingly insignificant place. And the real mystery was why. The site is known as the Parnell Mound, or Archaeological Site 8C0326. It sits near White Springs in Columbia County, Florida, in the middle Suwannee River Valley. Today, the landscape gives little indication of what happened here, but beneath it lies a 5-acre archaeological site associated with the Suwannee Valley archaeological culture. At the center is a sand burial mound about 3.5 meters high. Around it are scattered concentrations of artifacts, especially pottery and stone material. And about 30 meters north of the mound summit was the feature that would become the center of the investigation, a large pit. The Florida Museum of Natural History investigated Parnell during fieldwork in the summers of 2011 and 2012 under the direction of archaeologist Neil Wallace. The site belonged to the Mississippi period, broadly dated from around AD 1000 to 1500. But one particular layer eventually produced a much tighter date. Charred wood from the bottom of the pit produced a calibrated radiocarbon range of approximately AD 1160 to 1260. So whatever happened here occurred during a period when people were already using this landscape in complex ways. And the evidence suggested they weren't simply passing through. Something had happened here. Something large enough to leave thousands of fragments behind. The pit itself wasn't enormous. It measured roughly 2.5 by 3 meters across and was more than half a meter deep. That's small enough to fit comfortably inside an average room. Yet within and around this relatively small feature, archaeologists found an extraordinary concentration of material. 14 square meters were excavated inside and immediately outside the feature, representing roughly 90% of it. And that's when the numbers began to become difficult to ignore. More than 5,000 pottery sherds were recovered in the detailed excavation data. The Florida Museum summarizes the assemblage as more than 4,500 pottery sherds. Those fragments represented at least 100 vessels. Many were large open bowls. That detail matters, because if archaeologists had simply found thousands of tiny, unrelated fragments scattered across a large settlement, the interpretation would be very different. Instead, much of the pottery was concentrated around one discrete feature, and that concentration gave researchers something unusual, a snapshot, not of everyday life over hundreds of years, but potentially of a specific event. Then came the animal remains. Nearly 10,000 identifiable vertebrate specimens were represented in the analyzed assemblage. Together, they represented at least 215 individual animals across 35 taxa. There were mammals, turtles, fish, and turkey. But one animal stood out: deer. At least 88 individual white-tailed deer were represented. Think about that number. 88 deer, associated with a single archaeological feature. And the bones weren't distributed randomly. Certain portions of the animals were unusually common. The forequarters and hindquarters of deer were overrepresented, while other animals appeared mainly through teeth, jaws, or other specific parts. That pattern gave archaeologists another clue. This wasn't simply an accidental accumulation of animals. The remains had been processed, consumed, deposited, or arranged in particular ways. And the pit itself contained evidence of intense burning. At its base was a layer of dense charcoal mixed with dark, organically stained sand. Above that was a dense concentration of animal bone. Some bones were still whole or articulated, meaning they remained connected in anatomical relationships. Then the rest of the pit had been filled with darker sand and more fragmented animal remains. The layers were beginning to look less like random garbage, and more like the remains of a sequence of events. But here's where the story gets interesting. If people had simply gathered for dinner, why bury the remains? And if this was a ritual deposit, why were there so many ordinary objects mixed into it? Pottery, stone flakes, arrow points, grinding and abrading tools, hearth rocks, hematite, quartz crystals. The excavation produced 10 chert arrow tips, nearly 1,000 pieces of chert or silicified coral debitage, 44 sandstone abraders and grinders, hundreds of ferruginous nodules that appear to have been used as hearth rocks, plus small pieces of hematite and quartz crystal. That is a strange combination. It looks like the remains of an event in which people cooked, ate, worked, and deliberately deposited objects. And that raised a much bigger possibility. Maybe the pit wasn't the remains of an ordinary meal. Maybe it was the archaeological footprint of a feast. The idea of a feast sounds simple, but archaeologically, it's surprisingly difficult to prove. A large pile of animal bones doesn't automatically mean a celebration. People need food. They butcher animals. They cook them. They discard bones. And over generations, those remains can accumulate. So archaeologists have to ask a harder question. Does the evidence represent ordinary household activity or a special event? At Parnell, several clues pointed toward the second possibility. First, the site itself appears to have been sparsely occupied. Second, the material was concentrated inside a discrete pit rather than spread evenly across a large residential area. Third, the quantity and variety of food remains were extraordinary. And fourth, the pottery assemblage suggested vessels associated with a large-scale gathering. Researchers Neil Wallace and Megan Blessing specifically used Parnell as a case study for understanding feasting at small sites. Their argument was important because archaeologists often associate enormous feasts with large, politically powerful societies. Kings, chiefs, urban centers, monumental architecture. But Parnell presented a different picture. Here was evidence that relatively small-scale, mobile or semi-mobile communities could organize gatherings involving substantial quantities of food and material. The pit was small. The event apparently wasn't. And then there was the mound. The pit wasn't sitting in isolation. It was positioned near a 3.5-meter high sand burial mound. That relationship changes the story. Because the people who used this landscape weren't simply dumping leftovers anywhere they could. The pit was part of a larger cultural setting. A mound, artifact concentrations, a carefully defined feature, and a huge deposit of food remains. Archaeologists have interpreted the activity at Parnell in terms of both feasting and ritualized deposition. That doesn't necessarily mean everyone gathered here for a religious ceremony in the modern sense. It means the act of placing these materials in the ground may itself have carried social or ceremonial meaning. And that distinction matters. The people who created the deposit left no written explanation. No inscription tells us what the feast meant. No surviving witness describes who attended. So archaeologists have to reconstruct the event from physical evidence. And sometimes, the evidence is surprisingly specific. Imagine the landscape around AD 1200. There are no roads leading into the site, no grocery stores, no refrigerated food, no trucks delivering supplies. A gathering of this scale required preparation. Animals had to be obtained. Food had to be processed. Fires had to be maintained. Containers had to be made or brought to the gathering. People had to arrive. And eventually, the remains had to be deposited. The 88 deer alone suggest an enormous investment of effort. But even that number doesn't tell us exactly how many people attended. Archaeologists cannot simply divide 88 deer by an estimated number of meals and announce a guest list. The remains were deposited through a complex process. Some animals may have been eaten at the event. Some portions may have been transported. Some bones may have been selected for deposition. And some materials may have had ritual significance. That uncertainty is important. The archaeological evidence strongly supports a major feasting event, but it does not provide a perfect transcript of what happened. And that's exactly why the Parnell Pit is so valuable. It gives researchers enough evidence to reconstruct the broad event, without pretending they know every detail. There was another clue hidden in the pottery. The thousands of fragments were not just useful because there were so many of them. Pottery can act like a timestamp. Styles, manufacturing techniques, temper, vessel shapes, and decorative patterns can help archaeologists compare one assemblage with another. At Parnell, the pottery helped researchers refine their understanding of the Sewanee Valley archaeological culture. The assemblage included many large vessels, providing clues about what kinds of containers were being used during the gathering. And that matters because pottery is not merely decoration. A large vessel can tell us something about how food was prepared, served, stored, or shared. Thousands of fragments can therefore become evidence of social behavior. The broken pieces are not just broken pieces. They are traces of an event. But there is an even bigger question. Why would a relatively small-scale society organize something this large? Researchers studying Parnell argue that feasting can have important social functions even in communities without cities or centralized states. A feast can bring people together. It can strengthen relationships, create obligations, mark important occasions, build alliances, express identity, or reinforce connections between people and places. In other words, food can become social infrastructure. A deer isn't just meat. A large pottery bowl isn't just a container. And a pit isn't necessarily just a hole in the ground. Together, they can preserve evidence of relationships between people. That's what makes Parnell more interesting than the headline number. The 4,500 plus pottery pieces get your attention. The deer make the story stranger. But the real discovery is what those objects reveal about the people who left them behind. And there is one final twist. For centuries, the people who created this deposit were essentially invisible. There was no written account of the feast, no surviving menu, no photograph, no eyewitness testimony, only soil, charcoal, broken pottery, animal bones, and stone. Yet those fragments survived. When archaeologists opened the pit, they weren't simply uncovering garbage from an ancient settlement. They were uncovering the physical remains of a gathering. The charcoal provided a date. The bones revealed what was eaten. The pottery revealed the vessels involved. The stone tools showed what else was happening around the feature. And the arrangement of the materials helped researchers understand that this was not an ordinary household midden. It was a concentrated event, one that appears to have involved food on a remarkable scale. And suddenly, the original question changes. The mystery was never really, why did archaeologists find 4,500 pieces of pottery in a Florida pit? The better question is, what kind of gathering could leave behind thousands of pottery fragments, nearly 10,000 animal remains, and evidence for at least 88 deer inside a pit only a few meters across? The answer, according to the archaeological evidence, is a large communal feast accompanied by ritualized deposition. But the exact meaning of that event remains partly hidden. And perhaps that's the most fascinating part. We can estimate the date. We can measure the pit. We can count the pottery. We can identify the animals. We can reconstruct the fire. But we cannot hear the conversations that happen around it. We cannot know exactly who sat beside whom. We cannot know what was said when the last meal was finished. We can only follow the physical traces they left behind. And those traces tell us something surprisingly human. People who lived nearly 1,000 years ago didn't just survive. They gathered. They prepared enormous quantities of food. They made vessels. They shared meals. They marked important moments. And when the event was over, they left its remains in the earth. Today, the Parnell site may look quiet. The mound remains part of a landscape that gives away almost nothing about the activity that once surrounded it. But beneath that quiet ground was a record of one extraordinary moment. A pit roughly 3 meters across. A layer of ancient charcoal. Thousands of broken pots. Nearly 10,000 animal remains. And at least 88 deer. The people who created that deposit could never have known that centuries later, archaeologists would carefully excavate it and reconstruct their gathering from the smallest fragments. They left no written story, so they left another kind. A story written in clay, bone, charcoal, and soil. And perhaps that's why the most important thing found in that Florida pit wasn't a single artifact at all. It was evidence that, nearly 1,000 years ago, a group of people gathered together, ate together, and then buried the traces of that extraordinary day. The pit survived. The people did not. But for a brief moment, their feast did. And when archaeologists opened the ground, they found it waiting there. If you enjoy archaeological discoveries that turn ordinary pieces of the past into extraordinary stories, subscribe for more.